Welcome to A Language I Love Is, the podcast that's all about languages, linguistics, and love. My name is Danny, and I am the host and creator of this whole podcast, and I am delighted to say with such pride and joy that this is the first episode of an all-new series, the podcast's third series, I'm very happy to say. After such a positive reaction to the first and second series, which we did last year and the year before that, I really had to make a third series. It just mattered so much to me that I had people getting in touch to say that they missed the show, they were wondering when it was going to come back, and they had some recommendations for guests and languages. I had to make it happen. It's all hugely appreciated. Now, for first-time listeners, allow me to introduce A Language I Love Is, the way that this podcast works. Essentially, every episode is a chance for you, dear listener, to get to know one language and one person who loves that language really well. It's an interview-based format, and the sections of the interview don't change. We start off, my guest and I, with what I call the language biography. That's really the language 101. What are the essential facts of the language that my guest loves in particular? We address topics like who uses this language, where can you find the people who use this language, is this language alive or is it historical, how does this language interact with people in society? All the essential information so that you, the listener, feel at the end of this section completely clued up with the language in question. After this, we move on to the first of my three questions. The first one is to my guest, what is your relationship to this language? How did you come to know it? What role does it play in your life? This will allow us to get to know not only the language even better, but also my guest, and something about the reasons why they chose to come along and talk to me on a podcast about this particular language. After that comes my second question, which is, amidst your whole passion for this particular language, what is one thing that you really, really like, that you would like to share with us today? This is often quite a challenge for my guests, many of whom are linguistic specialists who spend every day thinking about this particular language. It's often hard to narrow down their enthusiasm to just one facet, but it could be anything. Everything is on the table. It could be an aspect of the language's phonology, if it's a spoken language. It could be a little bit about its grammar. It could be something from its vocabulary. It could be something about the way that this language is used in society. Everything is on the table, as I say. After that, we move into the conclusion of the interview and my third and final question, which is, what is one point that you want to leave the audience with? As they go out into the world, much better informed and enthused about this language, what should they know? What should they bear in mind? So, that's the way that the format works. The format doesn't change, but nonetheless, the language and my guest always do. And to kick off this third series, well, I was a little bit starstruck because my guest was Gretchen McCulloch. Gretchen McCulloch is one of the doyens of public linguistics, of presenting the ideas and the field of linguistics to a broad, non-specialist audience. You may know her from the extremely good and extremely successful linguistic podcast, Lingthusiasm. She presents Lingthusiasm with Lauren Gorn, who I'm very happy to say I have also had on this podcast at the very end of the second series. So, Gretchen, I'm very pleased to say, having heard good things from Lauren about the experience of recording with me, agreed to come along and talk about one language that she loves and, well, gets to experience every single day. Gretchen is also, I should say, a writer and an author. She writes for Wired magazine, also about linguistics, and she is the author of the best-selling book, Because Internet. This wonderful book that talks about languages, changing languages in the era of the internet. It's a fantastic book. I heartily recommend it to you, and Gretchen is a natural communicator, a really enthusiastic speaker. I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to A Language I Love Is and giving the podcast, I hope, a good rating. That is always hugely appreciated to know that people are out there listening and liking what they're hearing. And also, for this series, something new. I would like to test out a Patreon. If you'd like to support A Language I Love Is, you can. You can head on over to Patreon, where you can support the podcast and also gain access to some bonus audio from behind the scenes. Well, without further ado, here's Gretchen McCulloch talking about a language that she loves. I'm just smiling as I'm saying this. I have such a treat for my listeners today because my guest is the star of Lingthusiasm herself, or one of two stars of Lingthusiasm, Gretchen McCulloch. So people, I mean, if you love linguistics, if you're in any way online, you will have come across her. You will have come across her website, of course, the podcast Lingthusiasm itself, her book, Because Internet, which was just a triumph, and I ended up with 2 copies of, for example, so I think that nicely illustrates my dedication. So
could share one with a friend.
I did. I actually did.
Good.
Yeah. Gretchen, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's hugely appreciated.
I'm so excited to be on here. This is so much fun.
Okay. Well, I hope the fun continues.
It's already going to be so much fun already. I listened to Lauren's interview and then I had to come on.
Okay, well, clearly then that interview went well. Lauren had a good time. She was able to recommend the experience. Let me pose to you the question at the heart of every episode. Gretchen, what is a language that you love?
A language that I love is Montreal French. I wanted to pick Montreal French in particular because I don't know if I am qualified to opine on the French language as a whole or even the Quebec language as a whole, but there are specifics about the sort of sociolinguistic situation in Montreal where I've been living since 2011 that I do encounter on a daily basis that I think are fun to talk about, and that it's also fun to talk about these sort of big international languages in their specific niches. So, hopefully someone else will come on and talk about other Frenches at some point, but this is the one that I am particularly fond of.
Well, that's a very nice introduction, and I should say once again that the name of the show is A Language I Love Is, and my guest has complete free reign to define that however they see fit. So yeah, Montreal French. Let's go. So, we're in Montreal. We are in Canada. This is going to be a North American heavy episode. Could you give us a sense, at least first and foremost, of the linguistics of Canada in general, before we focus in on the city of Montreal specifically? What is the linguistic lie of the land in Canada these days?
So Canada has 2 official languages, English and French. These are sort of legally and governmentally official languages that, all of the laws that are written in Canada are written in both English and French. Politicians regularly, have this sort of bits in English, bits in French in terms of public-facing speeches. The milk cartons and signage and things have English and French on them. And these are both colonial languages with respect to Canada. There are also some 34, I think, is the latest count that I've seen, Indigenous languages of Canada that have varying levels of numbers of speakers and sort of levels of official status. In the north, Inuktitut, which is the Inuit language, is an official language of the territory of Nunavut. Their parliamentary proceedings are all done, or at least translated into Inuktitut. So there are other languages spoken in Canada. There are a lot of immigrant languages spoken in Canada as well. But in terms of official status, we have English and French. That said, the majority of provinces, the majority of people in Canada are English-speaking. And so Quebec is a province of Canada, which is the only French-dominant province in Canada. There's another province, New Brunswick, which is much smaller, which is officially bilingual with English and French. The rest of the provinces, so the other 8, are English-speaking. And of course, English, it's a relatively popular world language, as the saying goes. So there is a sense that French is under threat from the rest of Canada, from the rest of the world, and that it's a thing that needs to be protected within the province. So there's been a lot of language laws over the course of the decades, primarily. I mean, if you want to go really far back, the first French territories in North America, the area known as New France, were in the 1500s. A lot of colonization in the 1500s, 1600s. There were also the Acadians towards the east, which is its whole own history. Then in the 1700s, France lost a war to Britain and ceded the territory of New France to the British, which sort of begins, but also, continues this experience of who's in charge here, where is the economic center, where is the government center. And there was a fairly extensive period of the French in New France, in Canada, in Quebec, being cut off from the mother country French in France. And so Quebec French preserves, much in the way that North American English actually preserves, some of the older features that are no longer used in the mother country. So like the R that I say in a word like car was originally there. And it's, a later innovation that doesn't pronounce the R in car and says ka or something like this. But the same thing in Quebec. So one of the words that often gets used for a car is un char, originally short for chariot, as in chariot. And in France, they use a word like voiture for car. But in Quebec, it's still very common to say char, mon char. As-tu vu mon char? Have you seen my car? Dude, where's my car? So I had a friend who was in France, Quebecois friend who was in France, and was like, oh, oui, mon char, kind of thing. And they looked at her as if she had just appeared from, like, the Middle Ages. And she's like, forsooth, where is mine chariot? Mine chariot awaits. And she was just like, no, this is an ordinary word that we use every day here. Like, this is not, I'm not trying to do some sort of, like, Shakespeare reenactment thing. Like, I'm just like, c'est où mon chat? Like, I'm just looking for this.
Yeah, this isn't a bit.
No, I'm not doing a bit. Exactly. Like, I'm just trying to live here. I'm just trying to speak. I'm not actually trying to use this vocabulary that you think of as very archaic. This is just an ordinary word. So there's a number of words. There are some sound distinctions that are still distinct in Quebec that are no longer distinct in France. And there are also some innovations, both in terms of words and pronunciations, and there are differing approaches to Anglicisms. My favorite of these is that in Quebec, you parquez your char dans un stationnement. So you park your car in a parking lot. You parquez ton char dans un stationnement. In France, you stationnez your voiture dans un parking. So in both cases, we still have park and stationner, but one of them gets used for the verb and one of them gets used for the noun, and they are different in the different regions. And there's no such thing as a parking here. It's called un stationnement. But of course, you parquez your char in it. And vice versa in France. Sometimes Quebecois people will be like, oh yeah, there's fewer Anglicisms in Quebec French, but there's just a different set of Anglicisms. Or another really fun example is the word for Wi-Fi, which is spelled the same in both France and Quebec. But in France, it's pronounced Wi-Fi, and in Quebec, it's pronounced Wi-Fi. Because I think they both borrowed them from English, but in Quebec, they had slightly more exposure to the pronounced form, to the oral sound of it in English, whereas in Quebec, they were looking at the spelling and be like, yeah, this looks like Wi-Fi to me.
So, I mean, all sorts of distinctions between Quebecois French and the French of Lexicon of France itself over in Europe, to the extent that it's going to be instantly recognizable when these two languages somehow meet, or dialects of the same language. A French person, a Canadian Quebecois, they'll recognize it instantly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if I'm in Europe, for example, and I'm speaking to people, normally they hear my English and they're like, oh, you're American, just because the US is much larger than Canada, and Canadian English and American English do sound quite similar to each other. And so it's an understandable thing to think. But in France, my accent immediately gives me away. Except that it's also more complicated than that, because I was technically taught French, Français hexagonal, Français de Paris in school. I did not actually learn Quebec French in school, despite the fact that the reason all Canadian children learn French or English respectively in school, in addition to French or English respectively, which they already know, is because of Canada being officially bilingual, because of Quebec existing. Despite that, Canadian kids, I grew up in Nova Scotia, I learned French in school. When I was younger, before I moved to Montreal, I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this. I was like, why are you teaching me the wrong French for me? Like, the reason I'm learning this language is so I can communicate with people in my own country. Why am I learning the wrong variety of it to do that with? I didn't learn this to communicate with people in France. I learned this to communicate with people in Quebec. And then I moved to Quebec and I complained about this to some people and they were like, oh yeah, but don't worry, because in Quebec, we also learn French in schools. And I was like, hang on, this doesn't make it better. This just makes it even weirder.
We humans tie ourselves up in linguistic knots. Nobody's helped practically by this situation. It's all to do with, remnants of prestige, colonial legacy, basically.
Yeah. And this idea that, so in English, we have this idea that there are sort of two cultural centers of English. There's the US and the UK. And then there are countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand and, South Africa and India and places that have sort of their own center, but also are positioning themselves relative to these two big colonial powers. Like when you think of books being published, they'll get published in sort of a UK edition or a US edition and then get distributed to other territories like from them as a basis. So English has this somewhat pluricentric, even though it's also, still sort of geographically localized thing. French still has this very much like France sets the standard and everywhere else in La Francophonie, which also includes, former French colonies in Africa, sort of follows that standard or doesn't follow it, but has this sense of themselves as doing things less prestigiously.
Understood. And I did want to just focus in on that thing that you mentioned previously about the sense that it's that Quebecois French is somehow under threat. It's clear that this is a real feeling, at least. I mean, this manifests itself in laws that protect the language, that demand its usage in certain contexts. And I believe also, not speaking from experience, I haven't had the pleasure of visiting yet, but it also reflects itself in an unwillingness of many people in Quebec to speak English. If people perhaps will, I imagine, be bilingual and understand, but there may be an unwillingness to speak with you if you just presume English. My question is specifically, firstly, if you agree with all that, but secondly, is the sense of threat, of risk, real?
Well, and this is why I wanted to talk about Montreal French as a slightly distinct thing from Quebec French. Because Montreal has a different sort of sociolinguistic situation with respect to English and French than I think much of the rest of Quebec does. And like politically, whenever you have either provincial election or federal election, Montreal tends to vote differently from how the rest of Quebec votes and this type of stuff. Like some people have joked, and I'm not sure if it's a joke, that if Quebec ever separated, Montreal would then separate from the rest of Quebec and become its own like city-state. I think the sociolinguistic situation is different depending on where in Quebec you're asking. I don't want to speak for necessarily the entire province, but here we are. There were a lot of educational reforms in the 70s, 80s, 90s, most notably Bill 101, which is sort of famous as this French language laws bills that set standards for example, signage in Quebec has to have French a certain amount larger than the English on the sign, or has to have the French larger than any other language, which creates these very interesting situations where you go somewhere like Chinatown, and you have very large signs for ravioli chinois, which is how they translate dumplings, as Chinese ravioli. Yeah, French really doesn't have an endogenous sense of a dumpling, so they're borrowing this Italian term to translate this Chinese term. I love it. But you have to have these sort of larger signs in Chinatown in French than in Chinese, which is a really interesting experience compared to being in a Chinatown somewhere else. But one of the things that I think was most successful about Bill 101 was making a law that unless at least one of your parents was educated in English in Canada, you as a child have to go to school in French for all your primary schooling. Because before this, children of immigrants would often just go to English school, even in Quebec, especially in Montreal, which has the most immigrant population in Quebec. There was this sort of sense of divide between, okay, well, if you're immigrating to Canada from, for example, Czechoslovakia, as the writer and linguist Julie Sedevy did in the 90s. She has this very interesting memoir book about doing this, which I absolutely recommend to people. It's called Memory Speaks. Well, and also Lingophile, which is her other book. She has two books about this. They're both good. So she has this recounting of being an immigrant kid in Canada and going to school in English and learning French on the playground from other students. And this was the idea that this was something that was normal to do. And then a few years later, they passed a language law that said, no, actually you have to go to school in French. And I think this policy has been very successful in terms of getting immigrants also sort of integrated within more of the fabric of Quebec society, rather than being like, oh, well, you're going to want to speak English because that'll give you more opportunities elsewhere. It's like, well, if you immigrated to Quebec, you want to speak English there. And there were a lot of Anglophones who left Montreal, especially moved to Toronto, or elsewhere in Canada as a result of these language laws. So the ones who stayed were sort of more open to speaking French and learning French. Like you used to be able to have people who lived in Montreal for their entire lives and were Anglophones and didn't speak any French. These days, that's much harder. Like you need a bit of French to get by, or you're likely to have a bit of French simply because it's more prevalent. So I think that many aspects of the language laws have been relatively successful. There is always controversy. Like there's the current premier, the current leader of Quebec has been proposing to expand them again and say, okay, we're going to actually increase the requirements that you'll now have to also pass a certain number of French courses if you want to graduate from university in Quebec, not only from the sort of elementary school and high school levels, it'll also be for university students. So because there are several English-speaking universities in Quebec, McGill, which I went to, and also Concordia. So this is some of the parts that get sort of very naughtily complex, and people have very different opinions about whether they think aspects of that are a good idea. One of the controversies that comes up is when you go into a shop, what language do people greet you in? Most of the rest of Quebec is just French speaking. But in Montreal, it's different. So many places in Montreal, they'll greet you with bonjour, hi. This is so famous. There's a coffee shop that has mugs that say bonjour, hi on them. This is not just a greeting in two languages. This is an invitation to you to pick a language. Because sometimes people will reply bonjour, hi back. But this doesn't necessarily give that person a whole lot of information, because what they want to know is which of these languages are you picking to reply back to me. You do get this in the rest of Canada sometimes as well, because especially if you work at like a national museum or something like this, you may be greeting people with bonjour, hi, or hello, bonjour. People don't seem to do hi, bonjour. I think it doesn't flow as well. But bonjour, hi, or hello, bonjour gives people the opportunity to pick a language in terms of what they respond in. And if you reply in both, that could be a like, okay, well, no, you pick, which is also, I think, one of the things that interests me is this language negotiation. Like, how do you decide what language a particular encounter is going to happen in? And this is something that's happening all the time in Montreal because it's a very bilingual city. If somebody says bonjour, hi, you reply in bonjour, then you're doing the rest of the interaction in French. If someone says bonjour, hi, you reply hi, you're doing the rest of this interaction in English. However, when people come and visit Montreal, so, we have friends who are, tourists who are coming from the rest of Canada, who are coming from the US, and they speak English, but they're trying to sort of be a polite Anglophone. One of my friends, what she always tells visitors is you should greet people back with bonjour, hi, and then keep speaking English, but sort of apologetically, because that will convey that you are a well-intentioned English speaker and not someone who's trying to only impose English. Because if someone works in a shop, they will be bilingual, because you don't get a job in a shop unless you're bilingual. So especially in like a tourist area or sort of a downtown area, depending on, if you go a little bit further out into some of the more residential areas, depending on the region, whether it's more Anglophone or more Francophone, you could be monolingual. But in most areas that tourists are likely to find themselves, you'll be bilingual in a shop. So how do you navigate that sort of bilingual interaction?
This is amazing. I said previously about how, in a negative way, how it's impressive how we humans tie ourselves up in linguistic knots. But then at the same time, with things like bonjour, hi, we come up with the remedy as well. We come up with the solution, which is really quite ingenious. I love that it's so much more than a greeting.
Right. One time this was a number of years ago, and I had some American friends visiting me. They were linguists, so of course we're all observing every interaction. And we were in the metro station, and we were trying to buy metro tickets, to go on the subway. And they didn't have the chip cards yet in the US, and so they couldn't use the machines. So we had to go to the kiosk and buy the metro tickets from a guy in the kiosk. So they go up to the kiosk and the guy, and they're like, hi, I'd like to buy one metro ticket, And he says back to them, bonjour, in the most absolutely rounded tones, bonjour. And they're like, yeah, hi, I'd like to buy a ticket. He's like, bonjour. And sort of doing the gesture of like, now you say it, like I'm a character in a French learning program. And they were sort of looking at me, and I speak French at this point, and I'm like, désolé, sont mes amis américains, like, sorry, these are my American friends, like they don't speak French. And he's like, bonjour. And he's like, look, I don't care how much you don't speak French, like everybody can say bonjour, and then we will do this interaction. Because there is in French, and more in France, but also in Quebec, there's a bonjour culture of it's very rude to have an interaction with someone until you've exchanged bonjours, and then you can have an interaction. So I think, I don't know, I haven't lived in English-speaking areas in a while, but I think you can go into a coffee shop and say, can I get a coffee, and just sort of start the interaction. Like maybe you want to say like, hi, can I get a latte or something like this? Or if you go into a store and you can't find something, you can go up to someone and say, excuse me, do you know where I can find the Staples or something like that? But in French, you have to say bonjour, wait till the other person says bonjour back, and then you can ask your question, and that's just how it is.
I am very glad that I'm having this before I visit Quebec for the first time. I will be ready. This is like a survival guide, I think, as well as a linguistic profile.
I was in France last summer, and somebody said bonjour to me in an elevator, which I was like I was in an elevator in my hotel, and they said bonjour on entering the elevator, and I was like, oh, bonjour, okay. But like in Quebec, I would not so much expect to say bonjour to someone in an elevator. And also I was on a train, and I was at one of those like 4-seat tables, and every single person who came and sat at my 4-seat table with me, who I did not know, said bonjour to everybody on arriving. Everyone who was there would say bonjour back. And then I think they all said bonjour upon leaving at like different times, but there was definitely a like, when you arrive, you say bonjour. I would not expect to do this in Quebec. Like that degree of bonjour is really higher than I have. But you do have to say bonjour to somebody in a restaurant, in a shop, in a like anywhere like that. You do have to exchange bonjours before you can do the rest of the interaction. I don't know. I kind of like it now. I find when I go to an English speaking environment, I have to be like, hello. They have to say hello back. Now I can ask my question. I can't just launch into like, excuse me, where do you keep the pears or something like that.
So much in a single greeting. It's barely a greeting by this point. Yeah. It's an invitation. It's a sign of politeness. I love it.
Yeah. So my friend, when she has people visiting her, she's like, even if you don't speak French, what you should do is greet people with bonjour, hi, and then you've switched languages. You've done the bonjour thing, and you switched languages, but you've indicated that you've done it in a relatively polite way. I had another friend who was visiting Montreal from Toronto, and she spoke relatively good French, but she'd learned it mostly in France. And she said to me, why are people looking at me like I have 3 heads when I ask them if they speak English? Because she would go in and she would say bonjour, and then she would say, est-ce que vous parlez anglais? And then they would just give her this look. And I was like, oh, no one says that here. The impression that I get is that in France, it is rude to just launch into English, maybe, because there's an assumption you shouldn't be assuming people speak it, so you should ask. In Montreal, at least, and again, I can't speak for the rest of Quebec here, there's an assumption that everybody is probably at least a little bit bilingual. And so what you're going to do is just keep switching a little bit until you achieve like the language leveling point where you're both doing the most efficient type of communication for you, or the most polite form of communication for you. And so if you look at someone in a confused sort of way, and I do this myself, people will switch languages. Like if you look a little bit, and sometimes you're just confused about something else and you have to be like, no, actually I was just trying to find something. But there's a sense of like, oh, well, you'll just switch languages if people are confused. Or if you want to try to do something in English, you'll sort of aspirationally say a bit in English. And then if they look confused, you're like, oh, well, I guess maybe your English is worse than my French. Maybe I better go back to French. So you have potentially a few interactions of switching before you decide like which language something is happening in. Like sometimes I've been at a cafe or something and I've spoken French to the barista when I'm ordering something, and then I hear them talking to their coworkers in English. And so I'm like, oh, well, I'll switch to English then if that language, if you're more comfortable in that language, but probably they can actually do both. Or if you use like, if I don't know a word in French, I will often just say the English word, but sort of in the middle of the phrase because there's so much code switching. And then either they'll supply the French word, or maybe the French word has become the English word, but with a French accent. Or maybe that'll cause the whole interaction to switch to English, which sometimes is what I need. So there's this very sort of interesting and complicated dance around like which language you're doing which thing in.
Complicated, and yet we manage it at the same time, which just, I think, just goes to show our linguistic brilliance. You've very nicely explained the sort of the pragmatics and the sociolinguistic side to Montreal French, but are there also other features that would set it apart? I mean, in terms of phonology, for example, the sounds of the language, are they distinct in such a way that, I mean, Quebec is a massive place. If somebody from, say, the far north of Quebec heard Montreal French, they could say, I know where you're from.
I mean, Montreal French, because of the way French and prestige work, it's more often that the rest of Quebec gets labeled with a different variety than it is that Montreal gets labeled. So the levels of French dialect or accent are known as the sort of most broad or the most rural or like least educated version. The most sort of folksy and typical one is known as joual, which comes from the joual pronunciation of the word for horse, which is cheval. but it's pronounced joual in sort of broadest joual terms. I would say that I don't think there's just one variety of Montreal French. There's definitely some old timers who speak like a much more, sort of a less written version of the standard, or a less standardized version that you're not going to find elsewhere. But overall, Montreal French is going to be a bit closer to that sort of international hexagonal French than something that's spoken more in a rural area. Like, I don't have problems understanding people in Montreal, but if I go into the région, into the more rural areas, I am potentially going to have problems understanding people. One of the features of Quebec French overall that is in Montreal is in words with a T or a D before a front high vowel, so that's U or E, there's an affrication. So instead of saying tu, which is, you have tu, or instead of saying du, you have du, or ti, like petit, for little, petit, or I'm trying to get a words with D, dis-moi, dis-moi, tell me, dis-moi. And so this is specific to Quebec French. I think you might get it a bit more strongly in the regional areas, but you definitely get it in Montreal as well. Also, the R sounds are very different. There's a whole lot going on with the R sounds because French, like traditionally speaking, French is analyzed as having like a uvular trill for the R, so rouge. But sometimes that's realized as like a uvular fricative instead, rouge, like a little bit less voiced. There are some speakers of French in Quebec that actually have an alveolar R, rouge. These are more old timers. I don't have that. And there's also some just sort of weird approximity thing, rouge, that is probably more Quebecois. I originally acquired a France accent for no good reason. And then I moved to Montreal in 2011 and I was like, I shouldn't have this accent. It's weird that I have this accent. I'm going to try to make my accent Quebecois because I'm living here now. That's the accent I should have had in the first place. So I'm going to try to have that. And for a year or so, people thought I was Belgian. I think because I clearly didn't sound like I had French as a first language because I was making all sorts of grammatical mistakes. But they were like, but if you spoke English as a first language, you would just be speaking English because you're trying very hard to speak French. But I also sounded sort of European and also probably looking at me like there's a certain amount of ethnic profiling or something. And they were like, so maybe you're Belgian? And also people sort of don't know enough about the Belgian accent to maybe know what it's supposed to sound like. So it gets sort of thrown into a catch-all accent of like, maybe you sound like you're from there. Anyway, I said pain au chocolat instead of chocolatine in a store, and they were like, where are you from? And I was like, okay, I will say chocolatine now. This is for like a chocolate croissant, which in Quebec is a chocolatine. I think also in the south of France, it's a chocolatine, but in Paris, it's very much a pain au chocolat.
We've strayed into very dangerous dialectological territory. I mean, these are words that could, these are words that threaten to rip France in two. So, the first of my three questions remains the same, as always. Gretchen, what is your relationship to this language, the language that you've chosen today of Montreal French? You've outlined it there, but could you just tell us briefly what's been your journey with this language?
I started learning French in school when I was 9, which is sort of the latest age that you're legally allowed to start learning French in Canada. And I really enjoyed my relationship with it from the beginning. I just thought it was a really fun thing to get to learn. But at the time, that was this sort of flattened out, internationalized, learnable French that wasn't particularly Quebecois. So moving to Montreal in 2011 for grad school at McGill was like, okay, I'm going to really try to speak this language. And like, as far as I'm concerned, the city speaks French to me. So that was the sort of like, I'm going to really try to get better at this and get practice talking with people. Even if they try to switch to English on me, I'm going to try to keep speaking French back. I feel like that was that sort of genesis with that. Yeah, I don't know, it sort of worked. I mean, there's always new words that I'm learning because there are a lot of words in languages. Have you heard about this?
One or two.
But yeah, I don't know. I think that's sort of the fun thing as well. There's not a point at which you get to stop learning because there's always more things to know about.
amidst all your knowledge of this language, you clearly have a very intense relationship. I mean, when you step outside your house, you need to speak this language really well, and you revel in it. Amidst all of this, is there one thing about Montreal French, aside from the bonjour hi, which I love, is there something that you particularly love about it?
I mean, I think that one of the most famous aspects of Montreal French and Quebec French for people who don't live here is the swearing, which is all based around these religious terms. You know, like in France, they'll swear with things like merde, which is shit, or putain, which is like whore. But I didn't ask you if we were allowed to swear on this podcast. But
I don't know. It's the first time now. I'll just put a little explicit, a little thing. That'll interest people, Ooh, what's going on?
Yeah. But in Quebec, the swear words are very much based around religious terms, even though the country has become a lot more secular in recent decades. But the swear words are still based around things like tabernacle, which is tabernacle, or calice, which is chalice, hostie, which is like the communion host. When I first moved here, I was like, these are kind of silly. Like, I don't think of a tabernacle as something that is particularly explicit, like you have to caution around saying children. And also the F word is totally fine, has been borrowed from English into French. And like Radio Canada will let you say it on air, but CBC in English will not, because it's like less explicit in French. Because they're like, oh, it's just this word we borrowed. Like, people can say it all the time. The Quebec French swear words, I have acquired over the last like decade and a half more of a sense of their tabooness because I've been around them. Because it's very hard to sort of acquire a real sense of something being taboo when you don't have the visceral childhood associations of being scolded for saying it, or someone getting their mouth washed out with soap for saying it, or something like that. But when we recorded an early episode about swearing for Lingthusiasm in like 2016, I was like, yeah, these swear words, I don't know, they don't mean that much to me. And now it's almost 10 years later, and I'm like, if I hear someone saying these words, I'm like, oh, this person's having a bad day. Maybe I'm going to be crossing the street to just let them have their journey and not be in the way of that. Because I do have the association of like, if you're saying this in public, like, there's something up with you that is making you not seem like a friendly person right now. And so I do have, don't have the association of like being a kid and being scolded for saying it, but I do have this association of like, oh, if someone's saying it in public, things might get heated, which I didn't have when I first moved here. So, this is sort of proof that you can acquire these taboo associations even a bit later in life.
After 2 series of this show, it's the first time that somebody has chosen swear words for this section, which is, why not? Swear words are great and fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Third and final question. We're wrapping up this episode now. What is something, please, that you'd like everybody listening to know about Montreal French?
That's a big question, and I did not think about this in advance.
I didn't say it would be easy.
Now I'm like, oh, I've got to say something profound.
I mean, Bonjour Hi was a masterpiece and a revelation, to be honest. So,
I think that one of the things that Montreal French really has illuminated for me is the degree to which language interactions are constantly being sort of renegotiated and personally negotiated, and that linguistic complexity and linguistic diversity is really fractal. It's not that there is one kind of Montreal French, or that there's one view of Montreal French, or it's not that there's one view of Quebec French or of French as a language in general. It's that there are micro differences even between my experiences of Montreal French and someone else's experiences of Montreal French, or between one person's experience of any language and someone else's experience of any language. We often try as linguists to come up with these sort of big stories or big generalizations, or put people as points on a map and try to map out variation. And that's very interesting, and I enjoy that. But also that languages are so incredibly different from each other, and yet we manage to understand each other anyway, because we're all sort of active agents who are participating in this process of linguistic negotiation and trying to make ourselves understood and trying to communicate with each other in the way that we can manage, that also reflects how we want to position ourselves with respect to each other, what we're thinking about in terms of politeness, what we're thinking about in terms of identity, like all of those things become relevant in something as simple as bonjour, hi.
Well, that sounded pretty profound to me. Sounded
Yes,
pretty
nailed
good. There's something that seems that you just pulled out of thin air. Yeah. Okay, sure. I totally haven't practiced. No, you live this. You live this as your everyday experience. So I understand that these thoughts, as a linguist and as a human being, they're just fresh in your mind. So I get it. Gretchen, I mean, usually I use this point to point people towards research, towards materials that they can use, but for various reasons, I think, as we've already discussed, there's probably not actually much out there that's dedicated to Montreal French. But
I think I think there may be, there's a course, there's a series that the government of Quebec has that uses archives from CBC, Radio Canada to help people learn specifically Quebec French. If someone's moving here, they can listen to Quebec language media. I find advertisements are a really fun source of very vernacular, Quebec and Montreal French, because they're really trying to do a play on words or sound like they're cool. I'm still very, very bad at understanding advertisements, which is kind of ironic because presumably they want to sell me stuff. But I'm like, that's supposed to be a pun on an idiom that I don't know. Okay, great.
Marketers, take note.
Yeah. But yeah, I think there are various people who've done research at different levels on Quebec French and Montreal French. I think Shanna Poplack has done a lot at the University of Ottawa, and Charles Boberg has done a lot of research on Montreal Englishes, Montreal Frenches, because since French is the lingua franca, there are a lot more different ethnolectal varieties of English in Montreal as well. So Montreal Italian English or Montreal Jewish English have their own distinct features because they're sort of speaking them only within a particular group of people. So yeah, there's tons of linguistic diversity in Montreal. More people should study it. There's a lot going on.
Well, I can do my best to link to some of that in the show notes, and of course, I heartily endorse the amazing linguistic podcast, The Gift, to a general audiences, of course, which is Lingthusiasm. Gretchen, just thank you so much. This has been an absolute delight to talk to you about this today. Just till the next time, and as I should say, perhaps au revoir, bye.
People don't say au revoir, bye, and I don't know why they do. I guess because the language has already been established by that point in your interaction. But bye has fully been borrowed as a loanword, at least into Montreal French. So I often will say merci, bye, when I'm walking out of somewhere.
Merci, bye, then.
Merci, bye.
That was my interview with Gretchen McCulloch, the linguist, podcaster and author about Montreal French. It was such a pleasure to talk to Gretchen. We spoke actually for 2 hours in total. She is such a natural communicator and just an all-round good egg. I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I enjoyed making it with Gretchen. Now, long-time listeners will know that the end of the interview is not actually the end of the overall episode. I like to end every single episode with my final fun fact. I may not be able to contribute much to your knowledge of Montreal French, but I can offer some related etymological nuggets of information. And for the end of this episode, I thought it would be relevant and interesting to talk about the etymology of the country where Montreal French is spoken. That is Canada. Basically, where did Canada get its name from as a country? Frankly, I think it's really interesting. The name of the country is all rooted in the first few interactions between European explorers and settlers and the indigenous people who were already living in the land that we today know as Canada. One particular person who seems to have played a large role in popularizing and spreading the name of Canada was an explorer whose name was Jacques Cartier. He lived at the end of the 15th century and the first half of the 16th century, and he was from Brittany, the region that is now today part of France. Now, what seems to have happened is that while Jacques Cartier was exploring, documenting and mapping the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River, he interacted with the indigenous populations who were living in the area along the banks of the river. In their language, they had this word kanata, which in general just meant a village or a settlement. They used it in particular for one village, directing Jacques Cartier to the village of Stradacona. Stradacona is where Quebec City is today. From this interaction and teaching Jacques Cartier the word Canada, it seems that he took this word not to mean just Strathcona, but all the lands that were under the control of one chieftain whose name was Donnacona. So what we find is a broadening of the word, an enlarging of the word from any village to one specific village that they were directing him to the lands in general that were under the control of this particular chieftain. And then quite quickly, in the 1540s, in the maps that he's publishing back in Europe, we find the first uses of the word Canada, specifically the country of Canadas, referring to this area in general. The word is broadening from one specific village to a region, a county, a country. From that, the term Canada continues to grow and grow until it becomes the country of Canada that we know today. So this is a word that has seen some success. It's broadened considerably over history. So that's all from me for the first episode of the third series of A Language I Love Is. If you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, please do consider giving the podcast a rating. It is always hugely appreciated. And if you want to support the show, head on over to the podcast's Patreon. I'll be back very soon with more linguistic goodness, a new guest and a new language that they love. And in the meantime, dear listener, keep well and keep loving language.